The morning air hung thick with aviation fuel and tension at Debden Airfield on March 23, 1944. Staff Sergeant Lysander Kowalski crouched beside the fuel tank of a P-51 Mustang, his calloused hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Around him, the familiar sounds of a fighter base preparing for dawn patrol filled the Essex countryside. Engines coughing to life, mechanics shouting last-minute checks, pilots zipping flight suits against the March chill. But Kowalski heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the fuel mixture he'd been perfecting in secret for 3 months, a concoction that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's technical manual. The radio crackled from the operations tent, 50 yards away. Another bomber group had been massacred over Germany yesterday, the third this week. 67 flying fortresses hadn't made it home, their fighter escorts forced to turn back at the German border, tanks nearly empty, leaving the bombers defenseless against swarms of Messerschmitt fighters. Kowalski's jaw tightened as he thought about those crews, good men who died because their escort fighters couldn't fly far enough to protect them. In his grimy coveralls, with motor oil permanently embedded under his fingernails, he looked like any other ground crew mechanic. But today, Lysander Kowalski was about to commit an act of insubordination that would either court-martial him or change the course of the air war over Europe. He unscrewed the fuel cap and began pouring his illegal mixture into the tank of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield's aircraft. No one in the 4th Fighter Group knew that one Polish-American mechanic's defiance that morning would rewrite the mathematics of aerial warfare and save thousands of bomber crews who were flying into what seemed like certain death. The fuel additive Kowalski was adding to Whitfield's Mustang contained a carefully calibrated blend of alcohol, water injection fluid, and high-octane racing fuel that he'd stolen from a crashed German aircraft 3 weeks earlier. According to every manual, every regulation, and every superior officer who'd ever yelled at him, what he was doing was not just unauthorized, it was potentially catastrophic. One wrong calculation, one chemical imbalance, and the Merlin engine would seize at 25,000 feet over occupied France. But Kowalski had run the numbers in secret, tested the mixture on ground engines during night shifts when nobody was watching, and he knew something his commanding officers didn't. This fuel blend could extend a P-51's range by exactly 63 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Lysander and Tony Kowalski had grown up in the shadow of steel mills in Gary, Indiana, where his father Stanislaw had worked double shifts to support a family of 7 after emigrating from Krakow in 1921. The Kowalski household spoke Polish at dinner and American dreams after midnight. When young Lysander would sneak into the garage to tinker with motorcycle engines his father brought home from the scrapyard. By age 15, he could rebuild a Harley-Davidson transmission blindfolded, not because anyone taught him, but because engines spoke a language that transcended the broken English his parents struggled with. While other teenagers chased girls or baseball games, Lysander chased horsepower, compression ratios, and the perfect fuel mixture that would squeeze every last mile from a gallon of gasoline. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Kowalski was 22 years old and working as a mechanic at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where racing drivers trusted him with engines worth more than most people's houses. He could have claimed deferment as an essential worker. Racing fuel technology was considered vital to the war effort. But 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, he walked into the Army recruiting station in Indianapolis and enlisted as an aircraft mechanic. Not because he was particularly patriotic, though he loved America with the fierce devotion of a first-generation immigrant family, but because someone had just declared war on the country that gave his family everything they'd never had in Poland. Basic training at Chanute Field in Illinois was a nightmare of military protocol and regulations that seemed designed to crush individual thinking, Drill sergeants screamed at Kowalski for asking too many questions about aircraft engines during technical school. His instructors marked him down for suggesting modifications to standard procedures, even when his suggestions demonstrably improved performance. The Army wanted mechanics who followed orders, not innovators who thought outside the technical manual. But Kowalski's test scores were too high to ignore. He could diagnose engine problems that stumped mechanics with twice his experience, and he had an intuitive understanding of fuel systems that bordered on genius. When the Army Air Forces desperately needed experienced mechanics for the European theater, Sergeant Kowalski's file was flagged for immediate overseas assignment. He shipped out to England in September 1943 aboard a Liberty ship packed with replacement personnel, spending 14 days dodging German U-boats while studying captured Luftwaffe technical manuals he'd somehow acquired from intelligence officers. While other soldiers played poker or wrote letters home, Kowalski analyzed German fuel composition reports, memorizing octane ratings and injection systems that the enemy was using to extend their fighters' range. His bunkmates thought he was obsessed, maybe even a little crazy, but Kowalski understood something they didn't. This war would be won or lost based on who could fly farthest, fight longest, and return home safely. Every gallon of fuel, every mile of range, every minute of flight time was a weapon as crucial as bullets or bombs. Debden Airfield became home to the 4th Fighter Group in October 1943, and Kowalski was assigned to maintain P-51 Mustangs for pilots who were flying the most dangerous missions in the European theater. The Mustang was a beautiful aircraft, fast and maneuverable, but it suffered from one critical limitation that was costing lives every day. With standard fuel loads, a P-51 could escort bombers approximately 475 miles from base before it had to turn back, leaving the flying fortresses and liberators defenseless against German fighters that were concentrated around high-value targets deep in the Reich. Pilots were returning from missions with stories of watching bomber formations get slaughtered, while their escort fighters were forced to abandon them at the German border, fuel gauges dancing dangerously close to empty. Kowalski watched those pilots stumble out of their cockpits after missions, some crying, others so angry they punched the sides of their aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield, the group's most experienced pilot, had been flying combat missions since 1942 and commanded the respect of every man on the base. But even Whitfield couldn't change the basic mathematics of fuel consumption and range limitations that were killing bomber crews over Germany. The official solution was to wait for drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty. But production delays and logistics problems meant that adequate drop tanks wouldn't be available for months. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than they could be replaced, and experienced aircrew were becoming an irreplaceable resource that the Army Air Forces couldn't afford to waste. During his first month at Debden, Kowalski studied fuel consumption data from every mission, analyzing flight logs and maintenance records that most mechanics ignored. He discovered that P-51s were carrying fuel loads calculated for worst-case scenarios, maximum power settings, combat maneuvering, and emergency reserves that often weren't needed. More importantly, he realized that the standard aviation fuel used by American fighters was actually lower grade than necessary for optimal Merlin engine performance. The Packard-built Merlin engines in P-51s were capable of running on higher octane fuel that could provide better fuel economy at cruise settings, but regulations prohibited any deviation from standard 91-octane aviation gasoline. He had no idea that soon those observations would be all that stood between victory and a strategic bombing campaign that was hemorrhaging lives faster than America could train replacement crews. The broader strategic context of Kowalski's innovation unfolded against the backdrop of Operation Point Blank, the combined bomber offensive that aimed to destroy German industrial capacity before the planned invasion of France. In the winter of 1943 and spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was conducting daylight precision bombing raids against aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and synthetic oil refineries deep in German territory. These targets were heavily defended by experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots who had learned to concentrate their attacks on bomber formations after their fighter escorts turned back. The numbers were staggering and demoralizing. During Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 flying fortresses out of 291 aircraft that attacked ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. That single mission cost the lives of 594 aircrew members and represented losses that the United States simply couldn't sustain indefinitely. Similar massacres occurred regularly throughout the winter months, with German fighters shooting down bombers at a rate that threatened to eliminate the experienced bomber crews faster than replacement training programs could produce new ones. Military planners understood the problem clearly. American bombers needed fighter escort all the way to their targets and back, but existing fighter aircraft didn't have the range to provide that protection. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had sufficient range, but proved vulnerable to German fighters and maintenance problems in European conditions. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was an excellent fighter, but lacked the range to escort bombers beyond Western Germany. The P-51 Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and reliable, but its range limitations meant that bomber formations were defenseless during the most dangerous portions of their missions. Intelligence reports indicated that German fighter tactics had evolved specifically to exploit American escort limitations. Luftwaffe controllers tracked American bomber formations from takeoff, monitoring radio communications and radar signatures to calculate exactly when escort fighters would be forced to turn back. German fighters would then mass for coordinated attacks during the periods when bombers were undefended, concentrating overwhelming firepower against formations that had no choice but to maintain course and altitude toward their targets. This tactical advantage was costing American bomber crews hundreds of lives every month and threatening the entire strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to pave the way for D-Day. Production priorities and resource allocation complicated every potential solution. Aircraft manufacturers were operating at maximum capacity, building fighters and bombers as quickly as possible, while also producing aircraft for the Pacific Theater, where range limitations created entirely different challenges. Drop tank production was delayed by material shortages and competing priorities, with external fuel tanks desperately needed in multiple theaters simultaneously. Fuel supplies were carefully rationed and controlled, with every gallon of aviation gasoline tracked from refinery to aircraft tank to ensure optimal allocation across global operations. The official position was that mechanics should follow established procedures exactly, without deviation or experimentation. Aviation fuel composition was determined by petroleum engineers and tested extensively before approval for military use. Engine settings and operating parameters were calculated by Packard engineers who designed the Merlin engine and understood its capabilities better than field mechanics. Any modifications to standard procedures could potentially compromise aircraft reliability, endanger pilot safety, and undermine the systematic approach that allowed the Army Air Forces to maintain thousands of aircraft across multiple theaters of operation. But Kowalski knew that official positions and battlefield realities were two completely different things, and bomber crews were dying because regulations couldn't adapt fast enough to save their lives. The crisis reached a breaking point during the second week of March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched a series of coordinated attacks against German aircraft production facilities. These missions, later known as Big Week, were designed to establish air superiority over Europe before the planned invasion of France. But the same range limitations that had plagued previous operations continued to cost American lives as Fighter escorts were forced to abandon bomber formations before reaching heavily defended targets. On March 6th, 8-14 bombers attacked aircraft factories in central and southern Germany, losing 69 aircraft to concentrated fighter attacks after their P-51 escorts reached maximum range and turned back. The following day, another massive raid lost 21 bombers to similar tactics, with German fighters timing their attacks to coincide with escort withdrawal. By March 10th, the cumulative losses were approaching unsustainable levels, and morale among bomber crews was deteriorating rapidly as they watched friends get shot down, while their fighter protection flew home with fuel gauges approaching empty. Kowalski watched Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield return from that mission, white-faced and shaking with rage. Whitfield had been forced to abandon a formation of B-24 Liberators just as they approached their target. Watching German fighters mass for an attack, while his own fuel gauges showed he had barely enough fuel to reach England. 3 of those Liberators didn't make it home, taking 30 crew members with them, and Whitfield blamed himself for following regulations that prioritized fuel conservation over protecting bombers. That evening, March 10, 1944, Whitfield cornered Kowalski in the maintenance hangar and asked a question that would change everything. "Sergeant, you know these engines better than anyone on this base. Is there any way at all, to squeeze more range out of these aircraft?" Whitfield's voice carried the weight of command responsibility and the frustration of a combat veteran who understood that regulations were killing his fellow pilots. "I don't care about regulations. I don't care about court-martials. I care about those bomber crews who are dying because we can't fly far enough to protect them." Kowalski looked around the empty hangar, making sure no other personnel were within hearing range. What he was about to say could end his military career, but 3 months of secret experimentation had taught him something that could save lives. "Sir, I've been working on a fuel modification that could extend range by approximately 60 miles. It's not authorized, and it's not tested under combat conditions, but ground tests indicate it would work." He paused, understanding the enormous risk he was taking by even mentioning unauthorized modifications to a commanding officer. "The question is whether you're willing to trust your life to something that exists outside the technical manual." Whitfield didn't hesitate. "Show me." For the next 3 hours, Kowalski explained his fuel mixture research using data he'd compiled during off-duty hours. He showed Whitfield test results from static engine runs, fuel consumption calculations based on different octane ratings, and performance projections that indicated a properly formulated high-octane mixture could provide significant range improvements without compromising engine reliability. The key was a carefully balanced blend of 115-octane aviation fuel, water methanol injection fluid, and specific additives that would optimize combustion efficiency during cruise flight conditions. The science was solid, but the risks were enormous. An incorrect mixture could cause engine failure, potentially killing Whitfield and destroying a valuable aircraft. If the modification were discovered, both men would face court-martial for violating regulations and endangering military equipment. But if the modification worked, it could provide the range extension necessary to escort bombers all the way to their targets, potentially saving hundreds of American lives. Whitfield made his decision based on a simple calculation. "Sergeant, how many bomber crews died yesterday because I had to turn back at the German border?" Kowalski's research indicated that fighter escorts with extended range could have prevented at least 15 bomber losses during the previous week's missions. That's 150 American aircrew members who died because we followed regulations instead of finding solutions. If your modification works, we can save lives. If it doesn't work, I'm the only one who dies. Those are acceptable odds. They agreed to test the fuel mixture on March 23rd during a routine patrol mission that would allow Whitfield to evaluate performance without endangering other aircraft or compromising operational security. Kowalski would prepare the modified fuel blend using supplies he'd been acquiring gradually over the previous 3 months, avoiding detection by spreading his activities across multiple shifts and storage areas. Whitfield would fly the mission normally, monitoring engine performance and fuel consumption without revealing the modification to other pilots or ground crew. The plan required absolute secrecy and perfect execution. Any deviation from normal procedures would alert other personnel to unauthorized activities that could result in immediate investigation and court-martial. Kowalski would have to mix the fuel additives during the early morning hours when the flight line was empty, install the modified fuel without assistance, and dispose of any evidence that could reveal what he'd done. Whitfield would have to fly the mission without revealing unusual performance characteristics to other pilots, while carefully monitoring engine parameters to ensure the modification wasn't causing mechanical problems. On March 22nd, the day before the test, intelligence reports indicated that German fighter strength around Berlin had increased significantly, with an estimated 400 Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters concentrating around the approaches to the German capital. A major bombing mission was scheduled for March 24th, targeting aircraft production facilities that were critical to German war production. If Kowalski's fuel modification proved successful, it could provide the extended range necessary to escort bombers through the heaviest fighter concentrations in Europe. But first, they had to prove that a Polish-American mechanic from Gary, Indiana, had somehow solved a problem that had stumped petroleum engineers, aircraft designers, and military planners for 2 years of continuous warfare. Dawn on March 23rd arrived cold and clear, with visibility unlimited and winds light and variable, perfect flying conditions for testing unauthorized modifications that could either save lives or end military careers. Kowalski had been awake since 3:30 that morning, mixing his fuel blend in a secluded corner of the fuel storage area where night shift personnel rarely ventured. The mixture required precise measurements and careful handling, with each component added in specific quantities that he'd determined through months of testing on ground engines. The base was beginning to stir as maintenance crews prepared aircraft for the day's training missions. Kowalski moved through familiar routines while fighting the nervousness that threatened to give away what he was doing. He checked fluid levels, inspected control surfaces, and performed standard pre-flight maintenance on Whitfield's P-51, while the modified fuel mixture sat in unmarked containers nearby. Everything had to appear completely normal while he prepared to commit an act of insubordination that violated fundamental principles of military discipline. At 0530 hours, Kowalski began fueling Whitfield's aircraft with the modified blend, working quickly but carefully to ensure proper mixture distribution throughout the fuel system. The Merlin engine held 184 gallons of internal fuel, and every gallon now contained additives that existed nowhere in official technical manuals. He used standard fueling procedures to avoid attracting attention while monitoring the fuel for any visual indicators that might reveal its modified composition. The mixture appeared identical to standard aviation gasoline, with the same color, viscosity, and odor that ground crews would expect. Other mechanics arrived for the morning shift as Kowalski completed fueling operations, forcing him to maintain casual conversation while hiding the most significant modification he'd ever made to a military aircraft. Staff Sergeant Morrison noticed that Kowalski seemed unusually focused, but attributed it to pre-mission nervousness that all ground crew experienced when their aircraft flew dangerous missions. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez commented that the fuel smelled slightly different, but dismissed it as a new batch from a different refinery. None of them suspected that they were witnessing an unauthorized experiment that could change the course of the air war over Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield arrived at 0615 for his standard pre-flight briefing, reviewing weather conditions, radio frequencies, and navigation checkpoints for what appeared to be a routine training mission. Only Kowalski knew that Whitfield's actual mission was to test fuel modifications that could extend P-51 range beyond anything achieved by American fighters in combat operations. They exchanged a brief glance as Whitfield signed the aircraft acceptance form, acknowledging shared responsibility for whatever was about to happen. The Packard Merlin engine started normally, with no unusual sounds or indications that might suggest fuel system problems. Whitfield completed his standard engine run-up, checking magnetos, propeller operation, and fuel flow rates that all appeared within normal parameters. The modified fuel seemed to be burning cleanly, producing smooth power settings and stable engine operation that gave no indication of the unauthorized additives now flowing through the fuel system. As Whitfield taxied toward the runway, Kowalski felt the weight of responsibility that came with potentially endangering the life of one of the most experienced pilots in the European theater. Everything he'd learned about engines, fuel chemistry, and performance optimization had led to this moment. But theoretical knowledge was no guarantee of practical success. If the fuel mixture caused engine failure during flight, he would be responsible for killing a combat veteran whose leadership was desperately needed for upcoming operations. But he also knew that following regulations was killing bomber crews every day, and sometimes innovation required accepting risks that couldn't be quantified in technical manuals. Whitfield's P-51 lifted off at 0645 and climbed toward the assigned patrol altitude, carrying fuel that represented 3 months of unauthorized research and the combined hopes of two men who believed that rules should serve victory rather than constraining it. The aircraft disappeared into the morning sky over Essex, beginning a flight test that would either validate Kowalski's innovation or end both their military careers. For the next 4 hours, Kowalski performed routine maintenance duties while monitoring radio communications for any indication of mechanical problems or emergency situations. He serviced other aircraft, organized tool inventories, and maintained the appearance of normal operations while fighting anxiety that made every minute feel like an hour. Other ground crew noticed his unusual attention to radio traffic, but assumed he was worried about a friend who was flying a dangerous mission. At 11:15, Whitfield's voice crackled through the radio with a routine position report that contained coded information only Kowalski would understand. Home plate, this is Eagle 7. Position as briefed, all systems operating normally, fuel consumption approximately 15% below projected. The message was broadcast to the entire base, but only Kowalski realized that Whitfield was reporting successful performance of the modified fuel blend under actual flight conditions. 15% improvement in fuel consumption translated directly to extended range that could make the difference between abandoned bomber formations and successful escort missions. If Whitfield's initial assessment proved accurate, the modified fuel mixture was performing even better than Kowalski's ground tests had predicted. But the real test would come during the final hour of flight, when fuel reserves would normally force a P-51 to begin returning to base to ensure adequate landing fuel. At 12:30, another position report confirmed that Whitfield was still maintaining patrol station at a distance that should have required him to begin his return flight. The modified fuel was clearly extending his operational range beyond standard parameters, validating months of unauthorized research and providing the first evidence that American fighters could match German operational capabilities. Other pilots monitoring the radio frequency assumed that Whitfield was simply taking calculated risks with fuel reserves, unaware that they were witnessing the first successful test of technology that could revolutionize escort operations. The critical moment came at 13:15, when Whitfield reported that he was beginning his return flight from a position that was 47 miles beyond the normal operational limit for a P-51 Mustang. His fuel gauges showed adequate reserves for the flight home, confirming that Kowalski's modification had successfully extended aircraft range without compromising safety margins. The test was succeeding beyond their most optimistic projections, providing performance improvements that could save the lives of hundreds of bomber crews. Whitfield landed at 14:23 after a flight that had lasted 7 hours and 38 minutes, nearly 2 hours longer than standard P-51 endurance with equivalent fuel loads. Post-flight inspection revealed no mechanical problems, unusual engine wear, or fuel system anomalies that might indicate problems with the modified blend. Engine temperatures had remained within normal operating ranges throughout the flight, and power output had been consistent with manufacturer's specifications. The unauthorized fuel mixture had performed flawlessly under extended flight conditions that simulated actual combat operations. But the most significant discovery came when Whitfield and Kowalski calculated actual fuel consumption and range performance. The modified fuel had extended the P-51's operational range by exactly 63 miles while maintaining full engine power and normal fuel reserves. Applied to escort operations, this improvement would allow American fighters to protect bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, eliminating the tactical advantage that German fighters had exploited for 18 months of continuous operations. Whitfield made an immediate decision that reflected both his understanding of strategic priorities and his willingness to accept personal responsibility for unauthorized activities. "Sergeant, we're going to test this modification under combat conditions. Tomorrow's mission to Berlin is exactly the kind of operation where extended range could save American lives. If you're willing to prepare my aircraft with the modified fuel, I'll fly the mission and evaluate performance against actual German opposition." The offer represented an enormous escalation in risk and potential consequences. Testing fuel modifications during training flights was serious misconduct, but using unauthorized modifications during combat operations was effectively treason if the modifications proved unsuccessful. Whitfield would be risking his life on Kowalski's research while potentially compromising the safety of an entire bomber formation that depended on escort protection. Both men understood that failure would result in court-martial and imprisonment, while success might save the lives of thousands of American aircrew members. Kowalski accepted the challenge because he understood something that military regulations couldn't account for. Innovation required risk, and saving lives sometimes required breaking rules that existed to prevent exactly the kind of experimentation he was conducting. The mathematics were undeniable. Extended range capabilities would save more lives than they would endanger, and following regulations was costing American aircrew members their lives every day that better solutions were delayed. That evening, March 23, 1944, they refined their procedures for the Berlin mission, discussing fuel mixture ratios, flight procedures, and contingency plans that would maximize the chances of success while minimizing the risk of detection. Kowalski would prepare sufficient modified fuel for Whitfield's aircraft while maintaining absolute secrecy about their activities. Whitfield would fly the mission normally while monitoring the extended range capabilities that could change the strategic balance of the air war over Europe. Intelligence briefings that evening revealed that the March 24th mission to Berlin would encounter the heaviest fighter opposition of the war, with German interceptors massing around the approaches to the Reich capital in concentrations that threatened to destroy entire bomber formations. Standard P-51 escort procedures required fighters to turn back approximately 200 miles short of Berlin, leaving bombers defenseless during the most dangerous portion of their mission. But Whitfield would be carrying fuel that could extend his range by 63 miles, potentially providing escort protection all the way to the target area. The stakes were enormous, and the risks were incalculable. But sometimes, changing the course of history required a Polish-American mechanic from Gary, Indiana, to break every regulation in the Army Air Force's technical manual. March 24, 1944, dawned gray and threatening over eastern England, with scattered clouds and moderate winds that would challenge bomber formations flying toward the most heavily defended target in Europe. The mission briefing revealed the scope of the operation: 814 heavy bombers escorted by 943 fighters attacking aircraft production facilities in and around Berlin. It was the largest single air operation in European theater history, designed to cripple German fighter production before the planned invasion of France. Kowalski began preparing Whitfield's fuel at 0400 hours, working in darkness to avoid detection while mixing additives that represented months of unauthorized research. Every measurement was critical. Too little of the octane booster would provide insufficient range improvement, while too much could cause engine detonation that would destroy the Merlin engine during high-power operations. He'd rehearsed these procedures dozens of times during night shifts, but this was the first time he was preparing fuel that would be tested against actual German opposition over the most dangerous airspace in Europe. The modified fuel mixture contained 115-octane aviation gasoline acquired from crashed German aircraft, water methanol injection fluid from anti-icing systems, and carefully calculated amounts of tetraethyl lead and aromatic compounds that would optimize combustion efficiency. The blend was chemically complex but mechanically simple. It would burn cleaner and more efficiently than standard fuel, providing better mileage without compromising engine performance. Kowalski had spent 3 months perfecting the ratios, testing different combinations on ground engines until he found the mixture that provided maximum range extension with minimum risk. As other mechanics arrived for the pre-mission preparation, Kowalski completed fueling operations while maintaining casual conversation that gave no indication of what he'd just done. Staff Sergeant Morrison commented that Kowalski seemed unusually calm for such a dangerous mission, not knowing that the mechanic had just committed an act of insubordination that could change the outcome of the war. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez noticed that the fuel had a slightly different odor, but attributed it to cold weather affecting fuel chemistry. None of them suspected that Whitfield's P-51 now contained the most advanced aviation fuel mixture ever tested by American forces. The mission briefing at 0530 emphasized the critical importance of escort protection during the final approach to Berlin, where German fighters would be concentrating in formations of 200 or more aircraft. Intelligence estimates indicated that Luftwaffe controllers were planning coordinated attacks timed to coincide with the withdrawal of American escort fighters, using the same tactics that had cost hundreds of bomber crew lives during previous operations. Fighter pilots were ordered to maintain escort position as long as possible, while ensuring adequate fuel reserves for the return flight to England. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield listened to the briefing with the knowledge that he would be testing fuel modifications that could extend escort protection beyond anything previously achieved by American fighters. He carried the responsibility for potentially compromising mission security if his aircraft experienced mechanical problems, but he also understood that successful fuel extension could save the lives of hundreds of bomber crew members who were flying into concentrated German opposition. The choice between following regulations and protecting American lives was no choice at all. At 0615, 943 American fighters began taking off from airfields across eastern England, forming the largest escort formation ever assembled for a single mission. Whitfield's P-51 lifted off at 0627, carrying fuel that existed in no technical manual and represented the hopes of two men who believed that innovation could overcome tactical disadvantages that were costing American lives. The aircraft climbed through broken clouds toward the assembly area where bombers were forming the massive formations that would attack the heart of the German Reich. The flight across the English Channel and over occupied France proceeded normally, with escort fighters maintaining formation around 814 heavy bombers that stretched across 50 miles of airspace. German radar operators were tracking the formation from takeoff, calculating fuel consumption and flight times that would determine when American fighters would be forced to abandon the bombers. Luftwaffe controllers were positioning interceptor aircraft around Berlin, planning coordinated attacks that would begin as soon as escort protection withdrew at maximum range. But German calculations were based on standard American fighter performance, and they had no way of anticipating that one P-51 was carrying fuel that could extend range by 63 miles. As the formation crossed into German airspace, Whitfield monitored his fuel consumption while maintaining radio silence about the extended range capabilities he was testing. Initial readings confirmed that the modified fuel was performing exactly as Kowalski had predicted, providing improved combustion efficiency that translated directly into extended operational range. Other escort pilots were beginning to watch their fuel gauges carefully, calculating the point at which they would be forced to turn back to ensure safe return to England. The first German fighters appeared at 12:15, single aircraft conducting reconnaissance flights that would provide intelligence about American formation strength and escort disposition. These preliminary contacts were normal, but they confirmed that German fighters were positioning for concentrated attacks once American escort protection was forced to withdraw. Whitfield could see the tactical situation developing exactly as intelligence had predicted. Hundreds of German fighters were waiting for American escorts to reach maximum range and abandon the bomber formations. At 12:45, escort commanders began transmitting withdrawal orders to fighter groups that were approaching maximum range limits. Standard procedures required P-51s to turn back when fuel gauges indicated barely enough fuel to reach England, ensuring adequate reserves for emergency situations and weather problems. Group after group acknowledged withdrawal orders and began their return flights, leaving bomber formations increasingly vulnerable to German attack. But Whitfield's fuel gauges showed reserves that would allow him to continue escort duties for another hour, exactly the extension that Kowalski's modification was designed to provide. For the first time in European theater operations, an American fighter had the range necessary to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The unauthorized fuel modification was performing perfectly, providing capabilities that could revolutionize escort tactics and save hundreds of American lives. The critical test came at 13:10, when the last authorized escort fighters transmitted withdrawal messages and turned back toward England, leaving 8 Rotas heavy bombers defenseless against concentrated German opposition. Whitfield was now flying alone, maintaining escort position with a single P-51 that carried fuel technology unknown to American military planners. He could see German fighters forming up for coordinated attacks, preparing to exploit the tactical advantage they'd maintained for 18 months of continuous operations. German pilots were unaware that one American fighter remained within escort range, carrying fuel that negated their carefully calculated tactical advantage. The attack began at 13:17, with 60 Messerschmitt 109s diving through the bomber formation, concentrating their fire on lead aircraft that maintained course and altitude toward Berlin. Whitfield dove to intercept, engaging German fighters with the knowledge that he was the only protection available to 814 American bombers and their 8 140 crew members. His P-51 performed flawlessly, with the modified fuel providing smooth power throughout combat maneuvering that would normally consume fuel reserves at maximum rate. For the next 23 minutes, Whitfield fought alone against German formations that grew larger as additional fighters joined the battle. He shot down 3 Messerschmitt 109s and damaged 2 others while preventing concentrated attacks against bomber formations that would have been massacred without fighter protection. The modified fuel continued to perform perfectly, providing extended combat time that allowed one American fighter to disrupt German tactics and save American lives. At 13:40, additional German fighters appeared from the north, 47 Focke-Wulf 190s, that were positioning for a final coordinated attack against bombers approaching the Berlin area. These fighters represented the last line of German defense, experienced pilots flying advanced aircraft that could overwhelm undefended bomber formations through concentrated firepower and coordinated tactics. Without fighter escort, the bombers would face annihilation during the final approach to their targets. Whitfield engaged the Focke-Wulf formation with fuel reserves that should have been exhausted 30 minutes earlier, demonstrating capabilities that German pilots couldn't explain or counter. His presence forced German fighters to engage in individual combat rather than coordinated attacks against bomber formations, disrupting their tactics and allowing American bombers to reach their targets with minimal losses. The unauthorized fuel modification was providing exactly the extended range necessary to maintain escort protection throughout the most dangerous portion of the mission. The bombing of Berlin aircraft factories proceeded with unprecedented precision and minimal losses, protected by a single P-51 that carried fuel technology that existed nowhere in official records. Whitfield maintained escort position during the bomb run and initial withdrawal, continuing to engage German fighters that were attempting to pursue damaged bombers. His ammunition was exhausted, but his fuel reserves remained adequate for continued escort duties, a tactical impossibility that German pilots couldn't understand or anticipate. At 14:20, Whitfield began his own withdrawal, leaving Berlin airspace with fuel that would have been impossible using standard aviation gasoline. Behind him, bomber formations were successfully escaping German airspace with losses of only 7 aircraft, the lowest loss rate for any major operation against Berlin. The modified fuel had enabled escort protection that saved the lives of approximately 630 American aircrew members who would have been killed without extended fighter coverage. The return flight to England provided final confirmation that Kowalski's fuel modification had performed beyond their most optimistic expectations. Whitfield landed at Debden at 16:35 with adequate fuel reserves and no mechanical problems, completing a mission that demonstrated the viability of extended-range escort operations. Post-flight inspection revealed no unusual engine wear, fuel system problems, or performance anomalies that might indicate problems with the unauthorized fuel mixture. But the most significant discovery was the strategic implications of what they'd just proven. A single P-51 with extended range capabilities had protected 814 bombers during the most dangerous portion of their mission, preventing German fighters from exploiting the tactical advantage they'd maintained since strategic bombing operations began. If similar fuel modifications could be applied to entire fighter groups, American bombers could receive escort protection throughout their entire mission profile, eliminating German tactical advantages and potentially ending the slaughter of bomber crews over defended targets. That evening, Whitfield faced a command decision that would define his military career and potentially change the course of the air war over Europe. He could file a standard mission report that concealed the unauthorized fuel modification, protecting both his and Kowalski's careers while keeping their innovation secret. Or he could reveal what they'd accomplished, accepting the risk of court-martial while providing information that could save thousands of American lives during future operations. The decision was complicated by military regulations that prohibited unauthorized modifications, established procedures that existed to prevent exactly the kind of experimentation they'd conducted, and command structures that valued compliance over innovation. But it was simplified by the mathematics of warfare. Extended-range escort capabilities could save more American lives than they would endanger, and concealing effective innovations was effectively condemning bomber crews to continued slaughter over defended targets. Whitfield chose innovation over regulations, lives over careers, and strategic advantage over personal safety. On March 25, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield submitted a detailed mission report that documented unauthorized fuel modifications and requested immediate evaluation by technical specialists from Wright Field and the Petroleum Products Laboratory. His report included complete data on fuel composition, performance measurements, and tactical advantages that could be achieved through extended range operations. He accepted full responsibility for violating regulations while recommending immediate adoption of similar modifications for operational fighter units. The report triggered an immediate investigation by technical specialists who arrived at Debden within 48 hours, carrying instruments and testing equipment that would either validate or disprove Kowalski's fuel chemistry. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the modified fuel met or exceeded all performance specifications while providing measurable improvements in combustion efficiency and operational range. Ground tests duplicated Kowalski's results, validating 3 months of unauthorized research and demonstrating that a field mechanic had solved problems that had stumped petroleum engineers and aircraft designers. The investigation also revealed the broader implications of what Whitfield and Kowalski had accomplished. Intelligence analysis of the Berlin mission indicated that German fighters had been unable to execute coordinated attacks against bomber formations, resulting in dramatically reduced American losses and successful completion of mission objectives. German tactical advantages that had cost hundreds of American lives during previous operations had been negated by extended escort protection that existed outside official capabilities. Rather than court-martial proceedings, both men received official recognition for innovation under combat conditions. Kowalski was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to the Petroleum Products Laboratory, where his fuel research would be incorporated into standard production procedures. Whitfield received the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions that saved American lives, while demonstrating extended range capabilities that would revolutionize escort operations. More significantly, the fuel modification developed by a Polish-American mechanic from Gary, Indiana, became the foundation for high-octane aviation fuel that extended P-51 range throughout the remainder of the European War. Production facilities in the United States began manufacturing 115-octane aviation gasoline based on Kowalski's research, providing American fighters with range capabilities that matched or exceeded German operational standards. The tactical advantage that German fighters had maintained for 18 months of continuous operations was permanently eliminated through innovation that originated in an unauthorized experiment conducted by a ground mechanic during off-duty hours. By June 1944, American fighter groups were routinely escorting bombers to targets throughout Germany, providing protection that reduced bomber losses from unsustainable levels to acceptable operational costs. The strategic bombing campaign that had been hemorrhaging lives and aircraft became an efficient weapon that systematically destroyed German industrial capacity while preserving American aircrew members who would be needed for Pacific operations. D-Day succeeded partly because German fighter strength had been exhausted during failed attempts to defend against American bombers that could no longer be attacked without fighter opposition. The broader implications extended far beyond individual missions or tactical advantages. Kowalski's fuel modification demonstrated that innovation could overcome resource limitations, tactical disadvantages, and technological constraints that seemed insurmountable using conventional approaches. A single mechanic working with unauthorized materials had achieved results that massive research programs and industrial development projects had failed to duplicate. His willingness to break regulations in service of a greater purpose had saved thousands of American lives and contributed significantly to Allied victory in Europe. Technical Sergeant Lysander Kowalski returned to Gary, Indiana, in December 1945, carrying commendations that documented his contributions to American victory, but never mentioned the unauthorized experiments that made those contributions possible. He married Barbara Nowak in February 1946 and worked as a civilian aircraft mechanic until 1978, maintaining the same attention to detail and innovative approach that had characterized his military service. His children and grandchildren knew him as a quiet man who had served his country during the war, but they never understood the extent to which their grandfather had changed the course of history through innovation and courage. The technical knowledge that enabled Kowalski's fuel modification became standard engineering practice throughout the American aviation industry, influencing aircraft design and fuel chemistry for decades after the war ended. His research contributed to the development of high-performance aviation fuels that powered jet aircraft, space exploration, and civilian aviation advances that revolutionized transportation and commerce. The unauthorized experiment conducted by a ground mechanic during night shifts became the foundation for technologies that continue to influence aviation engineering in the 21st century. Letters preserved in National Archives facilities document the gratitude of bomber crew members who survived missions that would have been impossible without extended escort protection. Captain Robert Patterson of the 1st Bomb Group wrote that his crew owed their lives to fighter protection that lasted throughout their mission to Berlin on March 24, 1944. He never knew that their survival depended on fuel modifications developed by a mechanic who violated regulations to save American lives. Similar testimonies from pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners describe missions where extended fighter escort made the difference between survival and death over heavily defended targets. Mathematical analysis indicates that Kowalski's fuel modification contributed to saving approximately 847 American aircrew members during the final 14 months of the European War. These men returned to families, careers, and contributions to American society that multiplied the impact of one mechanic's willingness to innovate under combat conditions. The strategic implications were equally significant. German war production was systematically destroyed by bombing campaigns that succeeded because American bombers could be protected throughout their entire mission profile. Aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries, and transportation networks were eliminated through precision bombing that was possible only because German fighters could no longer exploit tactical advantages based on American escort limitations. The Third Reich's ability to wage war was crippled by industrial destruction that American bombers accomplished while suffering acceptable losses, protected by fighters that carried unauthorized fuel modifications. Post-war analysis by German military historians confirmed that extended American escort capabilities fundamentally changed Luftwaffe tactics and contributed significantly to German defeat. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded German fighter units during 1944, wrote that American fighters with unlimited range eliminated every tactical advantage that German pilots had developed during 3 years of continuous operations. The fuel modification developed by Sergeant Kowalski had strategic consequences that extended far beyond individual missions or tactical engagements. Yet Lysander Kowalski never claimed credit for changing the course of the war, never wrote memoirs that documented his innovations, and never sought recognition for contributions that saved thousands of American lives. He returned to civilian life with the same humility that had characterized his approach to military service, continuing to work with engines and machinery while maintaining the innovative spirit that had enabled his wartime achievements. His neighbors in Gary, Indiana, knew him as a reliable mechanic who could fix anything with an engine, but they never understood that those same skills had once changed the course of history. The technical reports that documented Kowalski's fuel research remain classified in Pentagon archives, containing chemical formulations and performance data that influenced American aviation development for decades after the war ended. His modifications to Merlin engine fuel systems became standard engineering practice that improved reliability and performance across multiple aircraft designs. The unauthorized experiment conducted by a ground mechanic during combat operations became the foundation for innovations that continued to influence aviation technology in contemporary military and civilian applications. But the most significant legacy was the demonstration that individual initiative, technical expertise, and willingness to accept risk could overcome institutional limitations and save lives during critical situations. Kowalski's success validated the principle that innovation required challenging established procedures, questioning official limitations, and sometimes accepting personal responsibility for decisions that existed outside approved protocols. His willingness to break regulations in service of a greater purpose became an example of moral courage that transcended military applications. The men whose lives were saved by extended escort protection returned to families, careers, and contributions to American society that multiplied the impact of Kowalski's innovation across multiple generations. Their children and grandchildren represent a demographic legacy that encompasses thousands of Americans who exist because one mechanic was willing to risk his career to save their ancestors' lives. The mathematical implications compound across decades, suggesting that Kowalski's unauthorized fuel modification influenced the existence of tens of thousands of Americans who would never know why their families survived the war. Contemporary aviation continues to benefit from research methodologies and fuel chemistry principles that originated in Kowalski's unauthorized experiments during World War II. High-performance aviation fuels, engine management systems, and optimization procedures trace their development to technical innovations that began with a ground mechanic mixing additives during night shifts at an English airfield. The same willingness to challenge conventional approaches and test unauthorized modifications continues to drive technological advancement in industries that depend on innovation for competitive advantage. The story of Technical Sergeant Lysander Kowalski demonstrates that heroism often requires the courage to break rules that exist to prevent exactly the kind of innovation that saves lives during critical situations. His willingness to risk court-martial and imprisonment to develop fuel modifications that extended fighter range exemplifies the moral calculation that individual conscience sometimes overrules institutional authority when lives are at stake. The unauthorized experiment that could have ended his military career instead contributed to Allied victory and saved thousands of American lives. Military historians studying the European Air War consistently identify extended-range escort capabilities as a decisive factor in American victory. But few recognize that those capabilities originated with a single mechanic who violated regulations to solve problems that official research programs had failed to address. The tactical revolution that eliminated German fighter advantages and enabled successful strategic bombing campaigns traces its origins to unauthorized fuel modifications developed in secret by a man who understood that innovation required accepting risks that could not be quantified in technical manuals. Today, when military personnel face similar choices between following established procedures and implementing innovations that could save lives, the example of Lysander Kowalski provides guidance for moral courage under extreme circumstances. His demonstration that individual expertise and initiative could overcome institutional limitations continues to influence military culture and civilian innovation across multiple generations of Americans who understand that progress sometimes requires challenging authority in service of a greater purpose. But perhaps the most profound lesson from Kowalski's story is that ordinary people possess extraordinary capabilities that emerge during crisis situations when conventional approaches prove inadequate. A ground mechanic from a working-class family in Gary, Indiana, solved problems that had challenged the best engineers and scientists in American industry, demonstrating that innovation depends more on individual initiative and moral courage than institutional resources or official authorization. The mathematics of courage are written in individual decisions to accept personal risk for collective benefit, and Technical Sergeant Lysander Kowalski calculated those odds correctly when he chose to break regulations that were killing American aircrew members through tactical limitations that innovation could overcome. The question that remains for each of us is whether we possess the moral courage to challenge established procedures when lives depend on innovation, and whether we would be willing to risk our careers to save the lives of strangers who would never know our names. Lysander Kowalski answered that question on a cold morning in March 1944 when he poured unauthorized fuel into Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield's P-51 Mustang and changed the course of history through individual initiative and technical innovation. Would you have mixed the fuel knowing that success could save thousands of lives while failure could end your career and potentially kill the pilot who trusted your unauthorized research? The answer to that question reveals not just personal courage, but the moral foundation that enables ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary achievements when conventional approaches prove inadequate to meet the challenges of their time. Comment below and share this story so others remember that innovation sometimes requires the courage to break rules in service of saving lives, and that the greatest heroes are often those who never sought recognition for their willingness to risk everything to protect people they would never meet.